He did not look back. That was the first thing you noticed about him, even from a distance, even from the far bank of a raging river in the cold of a late November morning. The man on horseback sat at the edge of a cliff above the Indus River, and he did not look back. Not at the Mongol army closing behind him, not at the burning remains of everything he had tried to build, not at the bodies of the men who had followed him here and would not be following him any further. He looked at the river. The Indus was running high that season, swollen with autumn rains, deep and fast, and cold enough to stop a man's heart before it drowned him. The drop from the cliff to the water was 30 feet, maybe more. On the far bank, if he made it, was India. Safety, time. Behind him were 50,000 Mongol horsemen. He was 21 years old. His name was Jalal ad-Din Manguberti, and he was the last prince of a dead empire, dead. He had spent 2 years doing something that every military mind in the known world had declared impossible, fighting back. And for 3 extraordinary days in an Afghan valley not long before this moment, he had actually won. This is the story of those 3 days, and of everything that came before them and everything that came after. But first, the river. He spurred his horse forward, drove it off the edge of the cliff, and fell. To understand why a man jumps off a cliff into a raging river rather than surrender, you have to understand the world he was born into, and to understand that world you have to go back 2 years, to when it was still whole. In the year 1219, the Khwarezmian Empire was one of the great powers of the known world. It stretched from the eastern shores of the Caspian Sea all the way to the borders of India. It controlled the Silk Road, the great chain of trade routes that connected China to Europe, carrying silk, spice, jade, and gold across the roof of the world. Its cities were legendary. Bukhara was a center of Islamic scholarship that had been producing brilliant minds for 5 centuries. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, the accumulated learning of generations. Samarkand was a jewel of architecture, its blue-tiled mosques and colleges considered among the most beautiful buildings anywhere on earth. Merchants from as far away as Venice and the ports of southern China met in its markets. And then there was Merv. Located in what is now the country of Turkmenistan, Merv was, by most estimates, among the largest cities in the entire world at that time. Modern historians generally place its population somewhere around 700,000 people, though some medieval sources claimed it exceeded 1 million. Whatever the precise number, consider what that meant. London in 1219 had perhaps 20,000 inhabitants. Paris had perhaps 80,000. Merv was a metropolis on a scale that would not be matched anywhere in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. 500 years later, this was a civilization at its peak, wealthy, sophisticated, ancient, and it was about to be destroyed. The question that haunts every account of what followed is simple. How did it happen so fast? The answer begins with a single act of catastrophic stupidity. In the year 1218, a Mongol trade caravan arrived at the city of Otrar, on the border between Mongol territory and the Khwarezmian Empire. The caravan carried luxury goods from the east, silks, most likely, and jade, intended for the wealthy markets of Central Asia. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inelchuk, who was related to the empire's ruler by marriage, looked at this wealthy caravan and made a decision. He seized the goods. He executed the merchants, claiming they were Mongol spies. Whether those merchants were actually spies is a question the sources debate and do not resolve. The Mongols did use merchants as intelligence gatherers. That much is documented. But whether Inelchuk had genuine evidence or simply wanted the goods, history does not say with certainty. What history does say is what happened next. News reached Genghis Khan. Now, and this is important, Genghis Khan did not immediately declare war. He sent ambassadors to the Khwarezmian ruler, a man known as Shah Muhammad II, and made what was, by the standards of the era, a reasonable request. Punish Inalchuk, return the goods, let this be settled without bloodshed. Shah Muhammad had a choice in front of him. He could have handed over Inalchuk, paid compensation, and avoided a war. Many historians have argued that this was not merely possible, but obvious, that any ruler thinking clearly would have taken that path. Instead, Shah Muhammad protected Inalchuk, and then he ordered the Mongol ambassadors dealt with in a manner that even 800 years later is difficult to fully comprehend. One ambassador was beheaded. The others had their beards burned off, it's all. In Mongol culture, one of the deepest imaginable insults, and were sent back to Genghis Khan. According to the chronicles, when those men returned and delivered their report, Genghis Khan climbed alone to the top of a hill. He remained there for 3 days and 3 nights. Whether this detail is precisely accurate as recorded cannot be confirmed. It comes to us through later accounts, but what the sources agree on is what came after the silence. When he came down, he had made his decision. And in the courts and bazaars of the Khwarezmian Empire, no one yet knew that the world they lived in had just ended. The man who had invited this destruction was, on paper, one of the most powerful rulers in the medieval world. Shah Muhammad II commanded an empire that stretched across 1,000,000 square miles. Some historians estimate he could theoretically call upon as many as 400,000 soldiers, though this figure reflects total imperial manpower spread across vast territories, not a single field army he could deploy. Still, even accounting for that distinction, his military resources were enormous. But numbers, as we are about to see, do not tell you everything. Shah Muhammad had a problem at the center of his power, and that problem was his own mind. The Khwarezmian Empire had been built by his father and grandfather, and many of the territories under its control had been independent kingdoms just a generation earlier. The generals commanding troops in these regions often held deeper loyalty to their local princes than to the Shah in his distant capital. Muhammad was, by all accounts, deeply suspicious of his own commanders. Chronicles suggest he divided his forces deliberately among his various cities and regional governors rather than creating any unified command structure. Each garrison was told to defend its own territory. There was no central reserve, no mobile field army that could respond rapidly to a threat emerging anywhere along the empire's vast borders. Historians generally interpret this fragmentation as the product of profound distrust, though his precise reasoning is not recorded. Perhaps he feared what a too powerful general might do with a unified army. Perhaps his paranoia, which the sources describe consistently, had its own logic given how recently some of his territories had been conquered. Whatever the cause, the effect was catastrophic. He had built a structure that looked powerful from the outside and was hollow at its center. The Mongols were about to find the hollow place. The invasion began in early 1220. What followed over the next 2 years was one of the most devastating military campaigns in recorded history. The death toll was so enormous and the destruction so complete that its effects on the population of Central Asia can still be traced by historians and archaeologists today. Some scholars estimate the region's population may have fallen by half or more in the decades that followed. Figures as high as 75% appear in certain studies, though demographic data from this period is deeply uncertain and the true scale of the catastrophe is still debated. What is not debated is Bukhara. The city had a garrison of 20,000 soldiers and walls that had stood for centuries. When the Mongol army appeared outside those walls, the garrison made a decision that the Mongols had seen before and knew exactly how to answer. Rather than wait for a siege, the soldiers rode out to fight in the open field. In a single afternoon they were destroyed. Nearly all 20,000 men were killed. When the people remaining on the walls watched their entire army annihilated in a matter of hours, the will to resist collapsed. The city surrendered. Genghis Khan rode into Bukhara and, according to chronicles, accounts recorded after the fact, whose exact wording cannot be confirmed, addressed the assembled population from the great mosque with words that became legend. "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether he said precisely those words, we cannot know. What the sources agree on is what came after. The craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, engineers were separated out and sent east to work for the Khan. The young and healthy were taken as slaves. Everyone else was driven into the fields outside the city. And then the Mongols burned Bukhara. Not the chaotic burning that sometimes happens in the heat of battle, deliberate, methodical, room by room and street by street. The libraries burned, the mosques burned. Arab historians who visited the ruins in the years that followed reported that the destruction was so complete they could not tell where buildings had once stood. A center of Islamic civilization, 500 years old, was reduced to ash in a matter of days, and still, this was only the beginning. Samarkand was next, the capital of the empire. Walls 40 feet high, a garrison that may have numbered over 100,000 men by some estimates. And Shah Muhammad himself was inside with a large portion of his army. This was the moment, this was where the Khwarezmian Empire should have made its stand, where the Mongols should have finally met resistance worthy of the name. It did not happen. When Shah Muhammad looked at the Mongol forces surrounding his city, when he calculated, rightly or wrongly, what the odds were, his nerve broke. In an act that the chronicles describe with barely concealed astonishment, he slipped away from Samarkand in the middle of the night. He abandoned his army. He abandoned his family. He abandoned his capital and every person inside it. He ran. Samarkand held out for 5 days, not through fierce resistance but through negotiation over terms. When the city finally opened its gates, the Mongols made a promise. Civilians who cooperated would be spared. Garrison soldiers would be allowed to leave with their weapons. The people of Samarkand began to hope. That hope lasted until the gates were fully open and the Mongol army was inside. Then the orders became clear. The craftsmen were separated, the slaves were taken, and the garrison soldiers, every man who had been promised safe passage, somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 by various accounts, were executed. Every one of them, every one. The message was deliberate and it was understood. From that day forward, soldiers defending Khwarezmian cities knew that surrender meant death, which meant that every future siege would be fought to the last man, making the war bloodier for everyone. The Mongols had guaranteed it. Shah Muhammad ran and kept running. 2 of Genghis Khan's finest commanders, Subutai and Jebe, were dispatched with 30,000 men and one order: find the Shah and kill him. For months they pursued him across Persia. He fled from city to city. Baghdad refused to open its gates to him. The rulers of Western Persia wanted nothing to do with a man so obviously doomed. His retinue dwindled from thousands of loyal followers to hundreds, then dozens, then a handful of servants who stayed with him, the chronicles suggest, more out of pity than loyalty. Finally, desperate and broken, Shah Muhammad reached a small island in the Caspian Sea. It was December 1220. The island was cold and barren. There was nowhere left to run. The sources disagree on what killed him. Some say pneumonia, others say pleurisy. A few later accounts suggest, perhaps more poetically than accurately, that a man who had watched his empire collapse in less than 2 years, who had been rejected by every ally he sought, abandoned by every friend he had, simply stopped fighting to survive. That the will to live requires something to live for, and he had run out of things. However he died, the manner of his death was its own kind of verdict. The man who had ruled one of the world's great empires ended his life alone on a barren rock, in a cold sea, having accomplished nothing except bringing catastrophe to millions of people who had depended on him. His son was 21 years old. His son was in Ghazni, in the mountains of Afghanistan, with a small retinue and no army and no treasury and no legitimacy that most people would recognize. His son had just received news that his father was dead and the empire was gone. His son had a choice. He could go to India. He could go west. He could take whatever portable wealth remained and live out a comfortable exile, a prince in name only, telling stories about the world that used to exist. Instead, and any reasonable account of this moment has to acknowledge how extraordinary this was, he decided to fight. The question that would keep the Mongol Empire awake for the next 2 years was simple. How? There is a particular kind of courage that gets almost no attention in the history books, not the courage of the charge, the moment when a man on horseback drives forward into danger with the thunder of the ground beneath him and the noise of battle all around. That kind of courage is easy to write about. It is visible, it is loud, it makes for good stories. The courage that history tends to overlook is quieter. It is the courage of the morning after, the courage of a young man sitting in a cold room in a mountain city, reading a letter that tells him his father is dead and his empire is gone, and deciding, not in a blaze of rage, not in a moment of dramatic inspiration, but in the still, deliberate way that some people make the hardest decisions, that he is going to fight anyway. That was Jalal ad-Din in the winter of 1220 in Ghazni. He was 21 years old. He had a city, a reputation, and a small retinue of soldiers who had been loyal to him in better times. He had no treasury worth speaking of. He had no recognized claim to lead what remained of his father's empire. His grandmother, a formidable woman named Turkan Khatun, who had long preferred a different grandson for the succession, had spent years working against him at court, and her objections did not disappear simply because the court itself no longer existed. What he had, instead, was something harder to measure. He had spent years as his father's second-in-command. He had studied battlefields the way some men study holy texts. Not to memorize lessons, but to understand the living logic beneath them. He could look at terrain and troop dispositions and sense, before the calculations were complete, how a fight would flow. His father had recognized this. In a court full of men whose loyalty was always in question, a son was at least unlikely to betray you. So Muhammad had given Jalal ad-Din real responsibility, real campaigns, real experience. And now, with everything else stripped away, that experience was the one inheritance that had not been burned or abandoned or surrendered in the night. He sent out messengers across the mountains. The message was simple: the Mongols can be beaten. Come, and I will show you. The question was, would anyone believe him? They came, not all at once and not without doubt. The first to arrive were the remnants of the Khwarezmian professional army, cavalry who had escaped the massacres at Bukhara and Samarkand, men who had fled into the mountains rather than wait for Mongol execution squads. These were hardened soldiers. They knew their trade. But 2 years of watching everything they defended turn to ash had done something to them that military training does not prepare you for. They were capable. They were also haunted. Then came Timur Malik. If you wanted a single moment when Jalal ad-Din's gathering stopped looking like desperation and started looking like something real, this was it. Timur Malik was one of the legendary commanders of the Khwarezmian Empire, a man who had defended the fortress city of Gurganj against a Mongol siege for months, inflicting thousands of casualties, holding on far longer than anyone had expected before finally being forced to evacuate when the position became hopeless. He had survived when most of his world had not. He arrived at Ghazni with his personal retinue of battle-tested veterans, and his presence said something that no speech could have said as clearly: this is worth fighting for. Jalal ad-Din cemented the alliance the way such alliances were cemented in the medieval world, through family. He married one of Timur Malik's daughters, binding their fates together in the way that courts and commanders understood as a genuine commitment. His father-in-law, through an earlier marriage, Amin Malik, who controlled the Ghazni region and commanded 10,000 Turkish cavalry, was already bound to him. These professional horsemen, well-trained, disciplined, experienced in the Central Asian style of mounted combat, formed the reliable core of what was becoming an army. But the force that would make everything possible at Parwan came from the mountains. Approximately 30,000 warriors from the Afghan tribes of the Hindu Kush region made their way to Ghazni over the course of that spring and summer. These were not professional soldiers in any traditional sense. They were tribesmen, shepherds and farmers who fought because life in those mountains required it, men who followed their own chiefs and acknowledged no distant ruler's authority. They were, by every conventional measure, the most difficult soldiers imaginable to incorporate into a formal military structure. So why did they come? Because of what had happened at Bamiyan. Bamiyan was a fortress city in the Hindu Kush, and during its siege something occurred that sent ripples far beyond its walls. Genghis Khan's grandson Matugan, a young warrior whom the Khan was grooming for future leadership, and by accounts one of his favorite grandchildren, was struck by an arrow and killed during the assault. The sources that describe Genghis Khan's grief are consistent enough that historians generally accept the emotional reality, even when the specific details cannot be fully verified. He wept openly. For a man who had spent decades watching battle and death, who had built an empire on the controlled suppression of sentiment in favor of strategic calculation, open weeping was not a small thing. His grief transformed into an order that shocked even his own commanders. When Bamiyan fell, every living thing inside was to be killed. Not the garrison, not the fighting men, everything, men, women, children, the elderly, the livestock, even the dogs. The city itself was to be erased so completely that future generations would not know where it had stood. The Mongols carried this out. Modern archaeologists working in the region have confirmed what the chronicles reported, a level of destruction so thorough that Bamiyan's precise location was indeed uncertain for a considerable period afterward. The chronicles may employ some exaggeration in their details, as medieval accounts often do, but the physical evidence suggests the annihilation was real. Word of this spread through the mountain communities of Afghanistan with the speed that terrible news always travels, and it changed the calculation for every tribe in those hills. The Mongols had already demonstrated in city after city that surrender was no protection. Now they had demonstrated something even more disturbing, that sometimes there was no negotiation at all, that sometimes the decision had already been made before you had a chance to make yours, if they were going to die regardless. If the mountains offered no safety and submission offered no mercy, then they might as well die with weapons in their hands. When Jalal ad-Din's messengers arrived, 30,000 men came down from the Hindu Kush. By late summer of 1221, Jalal ad-Din had assembled a force that accounts place at roughly 60,000 men, though what that number represented in practice was something far more complicated than a simple head count. He had professional Khwarezmian cavalry who knew their tactics but had been broken by what they had witnessed. He had Timur Malik's veterans carrying the weight of Gurganj in their bones. He had Amin Malik's Turkish horsemen, loyal to their lord and primarily concerned with protecting their own territory. And he had 30,000 Afghan tribesmen who answered to their own chiefs, spoke different languages from most of the rest of the army, and had never fought as part of a large organized force. Under ordinary circumstances, commanding this coalition would have been a military problem with no good solution, different languages, different loyalties, different expectations about how warfare should work and who should give orders. The tribal chiefs, men like Saif ad-Din Igrak, who led significant contingents of Afghan warriors, were not subordinates in any conventional sense. They were partners, at best, Men who would fight alongside you as long as they believed in what you were doing and felt they were treated with the respect their position deserved. Holding them together long enough to fight a battle was going to require something more than authority. It was going to require a plan so clearly right that even men who disagreed about almost everything else could see it. Jalal ad-Din had been thinking. What he understood, and what most commanders of his era did not, was that you cannot defeat an enemy by trying to match their strengths. You have to change the nature of the fight itself. Trade routes connected Afghanistan to the wider world, and merchants carried stories as well as goods. It is possible, though no source confirms it directly, that Jalal ad-Din had heard, through those routes, of a battle fought nearly 30 years earlier on the coast of Palestine. At the city of Jaffa in 1192, a king named Richard of England had faced Saladin's forces, which relied heavily on Turkish horse archers, cavalry who used harassing tactics remarkably similar to what the Mongols employed: ride within range, shoot, retreat before the enemy can reach you, draw them out of formation, destroy them when they scatter. These tactics had broken numerous crusader armies. The heavily armored European knights were formidable in close combat but nearly helpless against enemies who simply refused to close. But at Jaffa, Richard did something that his own knights must have found difficult to accept. He ordered them to dismount, to stand on the ground and hold formation instead of riding, to let the enemy's arrows fall against a shield wall instead of chasing an enemy they could never catch. It worked. Saladin's charges broke against the stationary English lines. The battle ended without the decisive crusader defeat Saladin had planned. Whether Jalal ad-Din knew this specific story, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that he arrived, through his own observation and analysis, at a strikingly similar conclusion. The Mongol horse archers were faster than his cavalry. Their bows were better. Their training was better. Their discipline was better. Trying to fight them the way his father's generation had fought, horse archer against horse archer, mobility against mobility, was a path that had already been walked by better armies than his, and it led to the same destination every time. But what if his cavalry did not act like cavalry? What if they stood still? He got his first chance to test the idea before Parwan. A Mongol force had surrounded the fortress of Vallan, and Jalal ad-Din decided to relieve it. He moved his army through mountain passes that the Mongols had not bothered to guard, because, from a conventional military perspective, no one would attempt to move an army through such difficult terrain. He struck the besieging force from an unexpected direction, hitting their flank and rear while they were still oriented toward the fortress. The Mongols were caught completely off guard. They tried to organize a defense on broken ground, fighting uphill against an enemy who had achieved total surprise. Approximately 1,000 Mongol warriors were killed before the remainder fled across a nearby river, destroying the bridge behind them to prevent pursuit. Now, let that settle for a moment. Since Genghis Khan had turned his armies westward, Mongol forces had been essentially undefeated in open-field combat. They might occasionally fail to take a particularly stubborn fortress. Siege warfare was different from the open field, and walls could compensate for many disadvantages. But when Mongol cavalry had room to maneuver, when they could execute their tactics against an enemy in the open, the outcome had been the same every time. Until this small valley. Until this young man who moved his army through terrain everyone agreed was impassable. News of Vallan spread faster than a rider could carry it, and the word that travelled with it was simple and staggering: they can be beaten. Genghis Khan heard about it too. His reaction was, by all accounts, furious. For years, the reputation of Mongol invincibility had been as effective a weapon as any cavalry charge, more effective in some ways because it worked before the fighting even started. Cities had surrendered without a fight because the stories that preceded the Mongol armies made resistance seem not just difficult, but insane. That reputation was a carefully constructed instrument of power, and now, A 21-year-old prince who should have been running for his life had put a crack in it. Genghis Khan chose to deal with it by delegation. The commander he selected was Shigi Kutuku, his adopted son, his chief justice, a man of considerable intelligence who was absolutely trusted by the Khan and had been present at campaigns throughout the empire's expansion. He was given a force that most modern historians estimate at around 30,000 men, though some sources suggest a higher figure. Either way, it was a substantial and experienced force. What Shigi Kutuku was not, and this is the detail that historians have returned to repeatedly when examining what followed, was a battlefield commander. His documented role in the Mongol Empire was legal and administrative. He was a man of the court and the law, not the field. He had been present at battles, certainly, but independent command of a major engagement against a determined and innovative opponent was something different from anything in his background. Genghis had beaten armies 10 times larger than anything Jalal ad-Din could assemble. He had conquered half the known world. In that context, sending 30,000 elite cavalry against a refugee coalition led by an unproven prince, a coalition that had managed one surprise attack and nothing more, probably seemed more than adequate. It is only in hindsight that the decision looks like what some historians have called the first serious miscalculation of the entire Khwarezmian campaign. At the time, it must have seemed almost generous. Shigi Kutuku marched south toward Parwan and towards something he had no preparation for. When Jalal ad-Din learned that Shigi Kutuku was approaching with 30,000 Mongol cavalry, he made a decision that his own officers must have struggled to understand. He chose his ground carefully, a narrow valley in the foothills of the Hindu Kush, approximately 50 miles north of what would one day become Kabul. The valley floor was perhaps a mile across at its widest point, hemmed in on both sides by the steep walls of the mountains, broken and rocky underfoot. For cavalry that needed open ground to execute wide, sweeping maneuvers, it was a nightmare. There was no room to circle a formation, no room to strike the flanks and fall back and strike again. If you came into that valley, you came straight. He positioned his forces carefully. The professional Khwarezmian cavalry in the center, under his own command, Amin Malik's Turkish horsemen on the left flank, Saif ad-Din Igrak and his 30,000 Afghan warriors on the right. Timur Malik and his veterans held in reserve. Then he gave the order that no one in that army had ever heard before. Dismount, form ranks, we fight on foot. For a moment the order must have simply sat in the air without being obeyed. These were men whose entire identity as warriors was inseparable from their horses. In Central Asian culture, cavalry did not dismount except in defeat or in death. Infantry, men who fought on foot, were what you had when you could not afford horses. Real warriors, serious warriors, fought mounted. That was not a preference, that was a belief as deep as any religious conviction. Jalal ad-Din was asking his men to do something that violated everything they understood about themselves. They did it. Across the Khwarezmian lines, warriors swung down from their saddles and stood on the rocky valley floor. They raised shields, they knocked arrows, they planted their feet on solid ground and waited. When Shigi Kutuk's 30,000 rode into the valley and saw what was waiting for them, they had no idea what to make of it. The first day began at dawn. The Mongol cavalry advanced in their standard formation, light horsemen with composite bows leading the way, ready to execute the opening movement of a tactic that had destroyed armies from China to the gates of Europe. Ride within range, shoot, draw the enemy forward. When they charge, fall back. When they scatter, wheel and destroy them. But as the Mongols advanced into the valley, the terrain began to work against them. The space narrowed. 30,000 horsemen packed into a passage barely a mile wide found that the sweeping maneuvers they depended on were simply not possible. They could not ride to the flanks. The mountains were there. They could not build up to a proper charge. The rocks and broken ground slowed every horse. They were being funneled forward, whether they wanted to be or not. And the Khwarezmian lines did not move. They did not charge. They did not pursue. They stood in their ranks on solid ground, and they shot. The Afghan tribesmen on the right flank, men who had hunted in these mountains since boyhood, men for whom shooting accurately at distance was not a military skill, but a lifelong practice, found that shooting at Mongol cavalry from 50 yards was considerably easier than shooting at a mountain deer in poor light. They shot in volleys, carefully, steadily, without the lurching unpredictability that plagued every mounted archer trying to aim from a moving horse. Horses screamed and fell. When horses fell in that narrow space, they blocked the path of the horses behind them. What was meant to be a devastating cavalry advance turned into a slow, grinding approach into a wall of arrows, and with each step forward, the chaos deepened. By midday, Shigi Kutuku ordered his forces to pull back and regroup. The Mongols had taken significant casualties. Accounts suggest several thousand dead, though such figures from this period must be treated carefully, and they had achieved nothing. Not a single position gained, not a single section of the Khwarezmian line broken. For the first time in the entire Khwarezmian campaign, a Mongol force had attacked and failed. That night, in the Mongol command tent, Shigi Kutuku faced a problem he had no ready answer for. His troops were better trained than the enemy. His discipline was superior. His men were the finest cavalry in the world. And none of it had mattered because the enemy had refused to fight as cavalry were supposed to fight. They had stood still. They had shot from the ground. And the valley had made every Mongol advantage irrelevant. What he came up with for the second day was clever in its way. If direct assault was too costly, perhaps fear could accomplish what force had not. On the morning of the second day, Mongol scouts reported something alarming back through the Khwarezmian lines. The enemy force appeared to have nearly doubled overnight. Spare horses had been fitted with riders made of straw and cloth and positioned on the ridge lines. From a distance, in the morning light, they looked like reinforcements. In the Khwarezmian ranks, the effect was immediate. Soldiers who had held firm for a full day began to murmur. If 60,000 Mongols were coming now, if Genghis Khan himself had sent reinforcements, what hope was there? But Jalal ad-Din had been watching carefully. According to later accounts, though the precise details of how he made this determination are not recorded, he identified the deception. He sent word through every section of his line, "Do not be afraid. Those are scarecrows. Straw men on spare horses. Real soldiers were not enough, so they built fake ones." The message traveled through the army and did something unexpected. It provoked laughter, then defiance. The enemy had resorted to illusion because reality had failed them. And there is nothing quite so energizing for a soldier under pressure as the discovery that the enemy is frightened too. Later that day, the Mongols pressed hard against Igrak's Afghans on the right flank. The tribal warriors, the irregular fighters, the men that any experienced Mongol commander would identify as the weakest point in an opponent's line. The Afghans held, and then the Mongols executed the tactic that had broken formations across 3 continents. They turned and ran, the feigned retreat, the oldest trick in the Mongol playbook, and perhaps the most effective single battlefield maneuver in the medieval world. You gave ground. You made the enemy feel they were winning. You drew them forward until their formation opened and their discipline cracked. And then you wheeled around and destroyed them. 500 Afghan warriors saw the feared Mongols running away, and they could not hold themselves. They broke from the line and charged. The Mongols wheeled. The 500 who had abandoned their position were scattered and exposed in open ground, and the counterattack cut through them in minutes. Every one of them was killed. Igrak's right flank wavered. The coalition that had held for a day and a half suddenly looked fragile. If the Mongols could exploit this gap, If they could push through the right flank and take the Khwarezmian position from the side, the entire army might unravel. Jalal ad-Din saw it from the center. He had fought for 2 days from a defensive position. He had watched his men hold against the finest cavalry in the world. He had watched a deception turned into a morale weapon. And now, with his right flank faltering and the 3rd day still ahead, he made the decision that separates good commanders from something rarer. He was not going to shore up the defense. He was going to attack. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jalal ad-Din gave the order to remount. After 2 days of standing on the ground, 2 days of holding formation while Mongol cavalry broke against them like water against stone, the warriors of the Khwarezmian center swung back into their saddles. The sound of it moved through the valley in a wave, the creak of leather, the shifting of horses that felt the change in their riders and responded to it. The particular silence that falls over men who know that what comes next will either be the most important thing they have ever done or the last. Jalal ad-Din did not issue a long speech. The chronicles preserve no rousing words from this moment, and that absence feels right. Some decisions explain themselves. He raised his sword. The morning sun caught the blade, and then he spurred his horse forward, and the center of his army erupted behind him. Think about what he was risking. He was 21 years old. He was the last legitimate hope of a dynasty and a civilization that the Mongols had spent 2 years erasing from the map. If this charge failed, if the Mongol center held, if the narrow valley that had protected him for 2 days now turned against him, there would be no recovering. His army would shatter. The Afghan tribes would melt back into their mountains. The veterans who had survived Bukhara and Samarkand and Gurganj would have nowhere left to go. And he was leading the charge personally, not directing it from behind, not watching from a ridge with messengers ready to carry his orders. He was at the front, his horse's hooves throwing up dust from the rocky valley floor, riding straight toward the Mongol command position. The Mongols had perhaps 30 seconds to react. In open ground, 30 seconds is enough. A disciplined cavalry force can wheel, spread, and meet a charge from multiple angles, breaking its momentum before it arrives. But in that narrow valley, the same valley that had constrained the Mongols for 2 days, there was no room to spread. The mountains hemmed them in on both sides. The men and horses behind pressed forward, and the Khwarezmian charge was already there. The impact was tremendous. Horses collided, lances splintered. Men who had been alive a moment before were suddenly not. The noise, the screaming of horses, the crack of metal against metal, the voices of officers trying to hold what was already coming apart, filled the valley from wall to wall. Jalal ad-Din drove deeper into the Mongol formation, pushing toward the command standards, those sacred symbols around which Mongol units organized and cohered. And then something happened that no one, not Shigi Kutuku, not his commanders, not the Mongol warriors who had spent their lives believing in their own invincibility, had ever seen before in this campaign. The center broke. It did not bend, it did not slow and hold, it broke. The line that had stood for 2 days suddenly losing its shape, men pulling back, the organized defense becoming men trying to create space and then men simply trying to survive. Whether it was the shock of the charge or the accumulated weight of 2 days of losses or some threshold of endurance that had finally been reached, historians cannot say with certainty. What they agree on is what happened next. When the center gave way, the flanks followed. Panic, once it begins in a military formation, does not respect rank or training or pride. It moves faster than orders. Within minutes, the entire Mongol force was in retreat, and the valley that had constrained them on the advance now trapped them on the withdrawal. The pursuit was relentless. Warriors who had been running for 2 years, who had watched their cities burn and their families scattered and their world reduced to ash, now had their enemies at their mercy. and they showed the mercy they had been shown. The accounts of what followed are disturbing in their detail, and some of those details cannot be fully verified. What the sources agree on is that Mongol standards were captured, those sacred organizational symbols whose loss represented in Mongol military culture something close to ultimate disgrace, and that casualties were staggering. Medieval chronicles place Mongol losses at more than 15,000 dead, though figures from this period must always be treated carefully. What is not in dispute is that Shigi Kutuku escaped with the remnants of his force, perhaps half of what he had brought into that valley 3 days earlier. The invincible had been defeated. For the first time since Genghis Khan had turned his armies westward, a Mongol force had been comprehensively destroyed in open combat. The news traveled faster than any rider. Within days, cities that had submitted to Mongol occupation were hearing the word Parwan, a valley in Afghanistan. 3 days. A prince no one had heard of, commanding an army that should not have existed, had done what every experienced commander in the Islamic world had declared impossible. In Merv, a leader organized an uprising and killed the Mongol garrison. In Herat, citizens expelled their overseers. In Bukhara, rebels launched attacks on Mongol positions. The occupied territories, which had been held in place as much by hopelessness as by force, began to stir. When people believe that resistance is futile, they do not resist. When someone proves otherwise, everything changes. Jalal ad-Din sent a message to Genghis Khan. The chronicles preserve its substance, if not its exact wording, and the substance was a direct challenge sent from a 21-year-old prince to the greatest conqueror in human history. Name the place, and I will meet you there. The audacity of it is almost impossible to fully appreciate. He had just won the greatest upset in Central Asian military history. His army was intact. Cities were rising. He had momentum, credibility, and the one thing that his father had never possessed: the demonstrated ability to deliver a victory against the Mongols in the field. This was the moment to consolidate, to negotiate, to use the shock of Parwan to build the broadest possible coalition against the inevitable counterattack. Instead, his army destroyed itself over a horse. The specifics of what happened during the division of spoils after Parwan have the quality of a nightmare, the kind where you can see the disaster approaching and cannot make anyone stop it. A white horse, fine and valuable, a prize of war that both Amin Malik and Saif ad-Din Igrak claimed as their own. An argument, the kind of argument that in a unified professional army with clear chains of command, a senior officer resolves in 10 minutes and no one remembers a week later. But this was not a unified professional army. This was a coalition of men from different cultures, different loyalties, and different understandings of what respect required and what insult demanded. Amin Malik struck Igrak with a whip, in public, in front of the army. In the honor culture of the Afghan tribes, this was not an insult that could be walked back or apologized for. A chief struck like a disobedient servant had only one response available to him that did not destroy his standing among his own people. Jalal ad-Din was forced to choose. Historians generally interpret his choice as reflecting political calculation. Amin Malik was family, and Amin Malik's Turkish cavalry were professional soldiers he could not afford to lose. Whether or not that reasoning was sound, the choice he made was the wrong one. He sided with Amin Malik. That night, Igrak's fires burned as usual in the Khwarezmian camp. The sentries saw nothing unusual. It was not until the first grey light of morning that someone understood what the silence meant. Igrak and 30,000 Afghan warriors were gone. They had slipped away in the darkness, leaving their fires burning behind them, a final, quiet gesture that was more eloquent than any declaration. Half the army, the men who knew these mountains, the fighters who had held the right flank at Parwan, gone, over a horse. Let that sit for a moment, because it deserves to. Jalal ad-Din had done something at Parwan that military historians still study 8 centuries later. He had chosen his terrain with genius. He had innovated tactics that no one in Central Asia had used before. He had held a fractious coalition together through 3 days of brutal fighting. He had led the decisive charge personally and broken the finest cavalry in the world. He had done everything right, and then he threw it all away because he could not manage the moment after the victory. The harder, quieter, less glorious work of keeping different men with different pride pointing in the same direction. The uprisings that had broken out across the occupied territories heard the news of Igrak's departure, and their courage faltered with it. They had been counting on a victorious army. What they learned was that the army had cut itself in half. Genghis Khan heard about Parwan, and this time he did not delegate. He assembled 50,000 men and marched south himself. This was no longer a military problem to be managed at arm's length. This was personal, in a way that the destruction of cities had not been personal. Cities were strategic objectives. This young prince had killed thousands of Mongol warriors, encouraged rebellions across occupied territory, and sent a taunting challenge, the myth of invincibility. That carefully constructed instrument of power had a visible crack in it. Genghis Khan intended to seal that crack with Jalal ad-Din's life. Jalal ad-Din, with 30,000 men remaining and Genghis Khan bringing 50,000, made the only realistic decision available to him. He retreated south, toward India, toward the Indus River, and whatever sanctuary might exist beyond it. If he could cross into the territory of the Sultan of Delhi, he might find the time to rebuild, to regroup, to try again. The Mongols, traveling lighter, gained ground every day. By late November of 1221, Jalal ad-Din reached the Indus River near what is now Calabar in Pakistan. The river was running high from autumn rains, deep and fast and cold. He needed time to cross. He needed boats or rafts or a ford shallow enough to wade. He needed perhaps a day. The Mongol vanguard appeared while his engineers were still working. What followed at the Indus was nothing like Parwan. There was no narrow valley to constrain the enemy. There was no terrain advantage to exploit. There was no tactical innovation that could change the fundamental reality. Genghis Khan, personally commanding a larger and fresher force, had caught Jalal ad-Din on open ground with his back to a river. The Khwarezmian formation was systematically broken. Units were isolated and destroyed one by one. Timur Malik, the legendary commander who had survived the siege of Gurganj, who had crossed half a continent to fight one more time, was captured. Some sources say he was executed immediately. Others suggest he was taken prisoner. He disappears from the historical record at the Indus, his fate uncertain, and the uncertainty itself feels like a kind of loss. Jalal ad-Din found himself on the riverbank with no way forward and the Mongol army closing from 3 sides. The 4th side was the Indus, 20 feet deep in places, running fast enough to sweep away a man who tried to swim it. He looked at the river. He did not look back. He spurred his horse to the edge of the bank and drove it off into the water below. Mongol archers fired. Distance, movement, and the chaos of a swimming horse made a killing shot nearly impossible. Against what the sources describe as considerable odds, the horse found the far bank. Jalal ad-Din pulled himself up from the water, and then, in a detail preserved in medieval chronicles, perhaps embellished in the retelling but too vivid to dismiss, he paused to clean his sword in the river water before riding away. Genghis Khan watched from the opposite bank. Later accounts, recorded years afterward, their exact wording impossible to verify, describe him turning to his sons and remarking that a father who had such a son should consider himself fortunate. The man who had spent months trying to kill this young prince, who had watched Jalal ad-Din cost him thousands of his finest warriors, could not help but recognize what he was seeing. Courage without calculation, defiance without hope of gain, the decision to jump rather than kneel. There is something that crosses every cultural boundary in that moment, something that even a man like Genghis Khan, watching from the far bank, could not pretend not to feel. He escaped with roughly 4,000 men. For 3 years he fought and maneuvered through what are now Pakistan and northwestern India, winning some engagements and losing others, finding no lasting allies because any ruler who helped him risked drawing Mongol armies to their own territory. In 1224 he crossed back into Persia and carved out a kingdom in the west, taking Kerman, parts of Khuzestan, Azerbaijan. For a time it looked like it might hold, but Jalal ad-Din could win battles. He could not build what he won. He fought the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad instead of making peace. He invaded Georgia repeatedly, turning potential allies into enemies. He could not hold coalitions together, could not build the institutions and relationships that transform military success into something durable. The flaw that had cost him after Parwan followed him everywhere he went, because it was not a flaw of circumstance. It was a flaw of character, the same fierce independence, the same refusal to compromise that had made him extraordinary on a battlefield. In 1230, a new Mongol army arrived. His forces dwindled, his allies disappeared. By August of 1231, 10 years, almost to the month after the extraordinary days at Parwan, Jalal ad-Din Manguberti was killed in a small Kurdish village in eastern Anatolia. The sources disagree on the manner of his death. Some say Kurdish peasants, recognizing a wealthy traveler, killed him for his money. Others suggest agents of his many enemies. A few accounts hint at something darker still. He was approximately 32 years old. His body was left where it fell. No state funeral, no monument, no empire to carry him home. What remains then? 3 days in a narrow valley in Afghanistan. A tactic that no one in Central Asia had tried before. Cavalry who dismounted, stood on solid ground, and broke the finest horse archers in the world. A 21-year-old prince who understood something that his father's entire generation had missed, that you cannot defeat an enemy by matching their strengths. You have to change the nature of the fight. He did that, completely, brilliantly, in a way that military historians still find remarkable 8 centuries later. And then he could not hold his coalition together after the victory. He could not build anything that lasted. He died in a ditch in a country far from home, having spent his final decade running and fighting and running again, with nothing to show for the most extraordinary tactical victory of his age. Some stories end in triumph, some end in tragedy, and some, the ones that stay with you longest, end in both at once. For 3 days in September of 1221, Jalal ad-Din Manguberti stood in a valley in the Hindu Kush and stopped the unstoppable. He proved that even the greatest power in the world could be outthought, outmaneuvered, and defeated. If you were willing to abandon everything you had been taught and try something no one had tried before. That valley still exists. The mountains are unchanged, the river still runs, and somewhere in its stones, if you know how to listen, there is still the echo of 30,000 horses and one man who decided to stand his ground.